am here in Conway Hall with Helen Steel. We're at an event. We've sneaked off to a back room. If you can hear lots of knocking in the background, that's what it is. So I'm just going to let Helen introduce herself and give a little bit of background about her activism and why you might have heard about her.
Hello. I don't know where to start. I've been involved in environmental and social justice campaigns since I was a teenager. When I was at school, I wanted to study agriculture, and actually I was told that the girls can't do agriculture, but me and my best friend challenged that, and eventually they let us do agriculture at school if we could find two boys to swap with us and do home economics. We did. We started doing agriculture, and then one of my favourite things was looking after the pigs at school. And then one day we took them to the slaughterhouse, and I then became vegetarian after that. I got involved in animal rights campaigns and then the environmental movement, and also Greenham Common, which was happening around the time I left school. And through all the people that I met on those protests, I learnt about other issues and got involved in kind of wider social justice campaigns, anti-racist campaigns, housing campaigns, anti-capitalist campaigns.
I think you're most famously known for the McLibel case, which I believe is one of the longest running legal battles in English history. Could you give us a little bit of background about that and how you got involved in that case?
So one of the groups that I got involved with in the 80s was a group called London Greenpeace, which is actually independent of the better-known Greenpeace. They did have common roots, but London Greenpeace remained independent. And it produced a leaflet about McDonalds called What's Wrong with McDonalds? Everything They Don't Want You to Know, which basically kind of took an overall look at the effect of multinational corporations on our society, the harm that they cause to the environment, the promotion of unhealthy food, targeting of children with advertising, low wages, being anti-union, cruelty to animals. And the group produced this leaflet, and then about a few years later, McDonald's started sending private investigators into the group. And by this time, I was involved with the group, and they then served writs on 5 people who were part of the group, me included, saying that we had to apologise to them or else we would be taken to court for libel. And we got an hour's free legal advice, and basically that advice was, you're on a hiding to nothing. It's really hard to fight a libel case at the best of times, but especially when you're up against a huge multinational corporation and there's such a wide range of issues. You'd be better off just apologising and using your energy to fight another campaign. And so 3 of the people kind of reluctantly decided that because of that they would apologise. And McDonald's had actually had a very long track record of forcing people to apologise over the past sort of 5-10 years before that. And they would hold up other people's apologies and say, see, they've apologised, you should apologise too. I felt really angry that they were asking us to apologise over things that was so patently true, you know, that they pay low wages, that they promote unhealthy food, that huge wasteful amounts of packaging and so on. And so I just said, no, I'm not gonna apologise. And then 2 of us fought the court case, and it became the longest running trial of any sort in England. The trial itself started in 1994 and we got the verdict in 1997. And it was a mixed verdict. The judge did find we'd proved many of the statements in the leaflet. He found some of them unproven, particularly things surrounding rainforests, where it had been particularly difficult because of our lack of resources to get witnesses over from countries where the rainforests were, to get them over to give evidence in court here.
Am I right in thinking that you were refused legal aid, so you had to fight all of this sort of by yourself with volunteer lawyers helping you out sort of on a pro bono basis?
Yes, there was no legal aid for libel, so we had no choice but to fight the court case on our own, raising money through donations. And initially it was really quite hard work. Gradually, as the case got more public awareness, people sent in donations, and more people, like a really critical part of the campaign was actually people in their local area deciding to sign up to a defiance pledge that they would carry on handing out leaflets no matter what McDonald's threatened. Or the weekend after the verdict, something like 2/3 of McDonald's stores were leafleted in this country, and McDonald's had been trying to get an injunction to prevent us leafleting again, and they'd said that if we breached that injunction we would go to prison, and so would anybody else. And because of the mass defiance campaign, they just basically backed down and didn't pursue the injunction and didn't pursue the costs.
I think it's a perfect case of the Streisand effect, where you try and keep something secret and it just explodes. And I think one thing interesting is that I didn't realise is that you actually lost the libel case in many aspects, and some of them were proven true, but I think it's almost like a textbook case now of when a corporation tries to crack down, it can have the opposite effect because it brought a lot of publicity towards the treatment of animals and the environment and labour and things like that.
Yeah, no, the case actually massively raised awareness of the issues, and it completely backfired against McDonald's. It was actually called the worst PR disaster in history or something like that at the end of the trial. The thing is that UK libel laws at that time, certainly, I'm less sure of what they're like now. Basically, the entire onus was on you to prove everything, and there was no public interest defence. Okay. And you couldn't argue that, like, for example, the World Health Organization had been warning of the risks of a high-fat, low-fibre diet for a long time, and connecting that to increased risks of heart disease and cancer. But even though we had witnesses who said that, the court would say, well, you have to show that McDonald's food itself is responsible for that. And so initially we lost that issue in the first trial, but we then went on to appeal and we won more during the appeal. We still didn't win everything. And then we took it to the European Court of Human Rights, and 7 years after the original verdict, we got the verdict from the European Court of Human Rights, which was that the case had breached our rights to freedom of expression and the right to a fair trial because there was no legal aid, and it was such an unfair battle that we'd been forced to fight.
I think it's a really interesting piece of British legal history and sort of environmentalist history. But I was just wondering what more recently you've been, again, campaigning in a new campaign with regards to the spy cops. I wonder if you could give a little breakdown of that for our listeners who may not be aware what that's about, some of the problems with the police and some naughty things they've been up to, basically.
Yeah, well, two of the people who were involved with London Greenpeace, I mean, we had, through the McLibel trial, we became aware that there had been at least 8 private investigators who had come into London Greenpeace meetings on behalf of McDonald's and were spying on the group. And they did influence the direction of the group as well. And then it turns out that actually there were also 2 undercover policemen. In 1968, the Home Office set up a secret political policing unit called the Special Demonstration Squad, which was officers were sent long-term into political campaigns in order to spy on those campaigns and give feedback information to the police, to Special Branch, and ultimately to the Home Office, in order to try and prevent those campaigns from being effective. And we had 2 of those, at least 2 of those undercover policemen who went to London Greenpeace meetings. First there was Bob Lambert, who actually turned out to have been involved in writing the leaflet that we were sued over by McDonald's. And then there was John Dines, who actually deceived me into a relationship around about 4 or 5 months before I got the writ from McDonald's. And so I was in a relationship with him throughout the first couple of years of having got the libel writ. You know, I would go to legal meetings, come back, talk to him about... Yeah, you do.
It's your partner, you tell them everything,
yeah.
don't you?
And I lived with him for a year as well, so he had like free access to everything that I had, as well as the inside of my head. He was, I suppose, the first person who I'd really fallen in love with. He told me that he was in love with me, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with me, that he wanted us to have a family. And we talked about all of those things. We talked about moving out of London and living together for the rest of our lives. And then quite a while into the relationship, his behaviour started becoming quite erratic, and he then disappeared. He came back for a while, but then he disappeared again, and then, he would write me letters, and I just kind of ended up not really knowing where I was with him. And then finally he sent these letters saying he'd left and he wasn't coming back because his head couldn't handle it anymore. And I was actually very, very worried about his mental well-being. And at this point, I obviously didn't know who he was. I started trying to track him down. Like he'd said he'd gone to South Africa, which had been quite strange at the time. I think it was still in the apartheid era. So it was like a really strange place for a political activist to go as a holiday destination. And well, basically, the more I researched trying to find him, the more everything kind of turned to dust. And like just everything that I investigated about him turned out not to be true. Eventually, actually on one day when I was coming home from the McLibel trial, I passed the registry of births, deaths and marriages, and I went in just kind of, I don't know, something made me go in there, and I looked through the death records. And at that point, I found out that he had been using the identity of a child who died when the child was 8 years old. And really at that point, my world kind of fell apart because this was, the person who I thought I'd known best in the world, I knew really well, I'd wanted to share my life with, had said he wanted to share his life with me. And all of a sudden, I didn't know anything about him at all. I didn't even know his name, Yeah. And it was, what's this about? This is just like, really, really weird. I don't understand this. None of it makes sense. And, there were various things that I thought about might be possibilities. One, which he might have been on the run as a political activist, or he might have been a private investigator, another private investigator for McDonald's. And one of the things I did think about was it was possible that he'd been an undercover policeman or working for the state in some other capacity. And because of that, I just felt, well, if I didn't know him, how can I trust anybody else? Yeah. How can I know what anything else that anybody else says, whether it's real?
Yeah. I think that's the thing. I mean, I think we've all been in situations like that when somebody you trust has betrayed you or maybe just lied repeatedly, and it really messes with your head and your perception of reality. It's like being gaslighted. It has an effect on everybody else. You sort of think, well, are you telling the truth? And it's really hard to trust people, and I mean, even friendships, but I mean, in relationships, I don't know how difficult it is to come back from that, because it just sounds awful. I mean, you hear about it, but just hearing it from you, it's somebody in your head. It's somebody that you trust with everything, and I don't know. It's a form of abuse which you can't really get your head around. I think.
No. I mean, initially, because I felt I couldn't really trust anybody, I didn't really talk about it to anybody. I just kind of bottled it up. And then I tried to do bits of research.
Was anybody else aware that he was an undercover police officer? Did you tell people in the movement to warn them about his deceptions so that they could be forewarned and make precautions?
At the time I found the death certificate, I didn't know. I didn't know whether he was an undercover policeman. I still didn't know whether he might have been on the run from the police. And so if I publicised it, actually, it could put him in danger from them. I didn't know whether he was a policeman. I didn't know whether he was a private investigator. I didn't know whether he was someone on the run or any other number of possibilities. And so I just ended up not talking to anybody about it, because I felt that the more people I talked to about it, the higher the risk was that it would get back to the state and I wouldn't find out the truth. So I kind of carried on. Well, I mean, for years I was fighting McLibel, so I just had to kind of focus on that.
So just like to go into a bit more detail about Spy Cops and how it was that, I guess, all these, whether or not women got together and started sharing stories, or how it came about. How was the state's complicity in these actions uncovered, and what actions have come from the case?
So about 18 years after John had disappeared, and my searches, although I'd found out more about who he was, I'd found out his real name, I hadn't actually managed to track down exactly what he was doing or what he was up to. But I was contacted 18 years later by a woman who had also been deceived into a relationship with an undercover policeman. And during the course of her relationship, the officer had admitted that my former partner was an undercover policeman. And around this time, I don't know if people remember the case of Mark Kennedy, who had infiltrated the environmental movement, an anti-capitalist movement, for about 7 years. And he had been exposed in the news as having been an infiltrator and having had a very long-term relationship with a woman who was a campaigner. And the police were trying to portray it as though this was some isolated incident, a rogue officer who'd gone off the rails. And I knew from, having talked to other women that wasn't true. That wasn't the case. And so we got together, and in the end there were 8 of us who brought a case against the Metropolitan Police to expose the fact that it was institutional sexism, effectively, that the police were using women to shore up the fake identities of these undercover officers. In our case, there were 8 women who'd had relationships over I think it was about a 25-year period, and with 5 different undercover police officers. So, it really demonstrated that it wasn't just individual rogue officers. I mean, now there's actually something like 30 women who are known about to have had relationships with undercover policemen. But yeah, we started this case and the police just kept trying to get it shut down, get us struck out of court. But eventually in 2015, they were forced to make a apology where they acknowledged, it was kind of actually something of an unprecedented apology, where they acknowledged that they had committed serious human rights violations by having these officers have long-term intimate relationships with women.
We've got another inquiry coming up. Is that the case? Theresa May begrudgingly has launched some sort of investigation kicking off in the summer. Do you know any more details about that?
Just a little. Yeah, I mean, actually, not long after we launched the case, a couple of us were interviewed for a TV programme that talked about the intimate relationships. And it had interviews with Peter Francis, who was a former undercover policeman, where he talked about the fact that the family of Stephen Lawrence had been spied on by these undercover units while their campaign was going on for justice for their son who'd been murdered by racists. So instead of the police, trying to investigate a racist murder, they were investigating the family to try and discredit them. And it was so blatantly outrageous once this was out in the public that Theresa May was forced to announce a public inquiry to kind of dissipate some of the anger at the outrageous conduct of these officers. And it wasn't just the Lawrence family campaign that was spied on, it was also other family justice campaigns for people who'd been murdered in custody or been the victims of racist murders.
So it seems like a common theme. The police seem to have a lot of disdain for people of colour and women.
Yeah, they do. I mean, essentially, they have disdain for anybody who is questioning the status quo, who wants to improve society so that, there's equal rights for all and people aren't treated as second-class citizens. That gets in the way of the rich and powerful having their luxury lifestyles, and they don't want anyone to get in the way of that, so they send in infiltrators to undermine and sabotage campaigns for justice and a better society.
Yeah. I mean, it's really disheartening. The police, you hear about the police being corrupt and then, they go and be corrupt, but I think we're just starting to uncover a lot of things now.
It is disheartening, but on the other hand, one, it shows that we can and do have an effect when we try to talk to other people about the change we want to see in the world. Basically, if they didn't interfere with it, I think we would create a much better society much more quickly. However, the fact that they do interfere with it doesn't necessarily mean that change won't be achieved, because going back through history, the first cameras that were bought by Special Branch were used to spy on the suffragettes, but ultimately the suffragettes succeeded in their fight. And, we can also look at sort of anti-apartheid and civil rights campaigns, which were both heavily spied on by the police and security services in the UK and abroad, and yet ultimately were successful campaigns. It's very undemocratic what the police are doing, but it's not a good thing if people just give up, because that happens. We just need to fight on and expose it and try and get it stopped.
I think I'm paraphrasing here, but there's a great line like, they wouldn't be trying to silence you if you didn't have anything valuable to say.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's sort of a bit like what I was saying about how, they know that we do have an effect when we talk to other people, when we leaflet, when we, carry out protests. It does make people think, is this the kind of world I want to live in? Do I want to live in a world that's based around a tiny minority of the population making profits at the expense of the environment and other people's lives? Or do we want to try and create a society where everyone has a say in how society is run and that's sustainable, that, we can live happily ever after?
So you popped up on my radar. I think I'd been aware of the McLibel case when it first came out in the 1990s, but I think you started popping up on my radar again after a bit of bother you've got in with the social justice movement. And I know that it's shocked, angered and saddened a lot of women on the left who obviously are aware of your history, and I've seen a few things occurring which are really making them stop and take pause about some of the behaviour of some of the men and some of the people more generally in a movement that is supposed to be based on equality and treating people equally. And there seems to be a lot of problems with the way they're treating women at the moment. I wonder if you could give us a bit more information about some of the things that have been happening with you.
Yeah, where to start? I mean, I had been concerned about gender identity politics, gender identity theory for quite a few years. I actually came across a letter that I'd written to The Guardian in 2003 about the issue, but I'd never really followed it up. And then I just kind of read bits and pieces online, and then it seemed to be becoming more and more involved in movements that I was sort of part of. And I kept meaning to write a leaflet and never quite getting around to it. And then at the Anarchist Book Fair in 2017, I had been chatting to a friend, and some people came up to the information stall, one of the information stalls, and they were complaining that leaflets were being handed out that were allegedly transphobic. And I went and I recognised the leaflet. I saw it was the SAGES one, the Sex and Gender Education Society or something. That was really quite a calm leaflet, just explaining various different terms. And so I went and spoke to the woman who was complaining. I said, well, what's wrong with it? And she said, it says that women don't have penises. And I was just like, what? What? You're complaining about that? And it was just trying to get your head around it. It's just like, what planet are we on now? Yeah. And I tried to talk to her a bit, but I wasn't actually working for the book fair on that day. I have in the past helped with bits, but I wasn't on that day. So I just kind of butted out of the conversation, left them to deal with it. And then I'd kind of walked away and was chatting to a friend somewhere else in the room, and all of a sudden I just heard all this noise and kerfuffle. So I went over, and there were two women who were handing out gender-critical feminist leaflets, and they were surrounded by a bunch of trans activists. And I saw the trans activists trying to take things out of their bags, just being really in their face and really threatening and screaming in their faces. And so I got between one of the women and the trans activists who were kind of surrounding her, and it was near a doorway, and I kind of got them, with other people, got them into a corridor and then spoke to them about what they wanted to do. It was really quite a threatening situation. And then one of them wanted to leave, and so they decided they were going to leave. I showed them the way to the station. I pointed out the way to the station and then went back in the building. And when I came back in the building, all of a sudden, within the space of a couple of minutes, I was surrounded and all these people were screaming in my face, "TERF, get out," and all sorts of abuse. And I just thought, I'm not going anywhere. I haven't done anything. I've got a right to be here. I refused to leave. And then these people were just surrounding me for an hour and a half, screaming in my face. And I think that if it hadn't been for the fact that quite a few people stepped in to get between those people and me, I think I probably would have been physically assaulted. Towards the start of the incident, there was a guy who, his hand came towards my face and I put up my arm to block him. And as I did that and pushed his hand away from my face, he started screaming that I'd assaulted him and I was transphobe and all of this kind of stuff. And it felt like it was a very scary situation. It felt very volatile. They were all like really worked up about the fact that two women had been handing out some leaflets. That's what book fairs are for. People hand out leaflets, and, you know, they hand out leaflets that lots of people don't agree with this or that or the other, and you just have a conversation about it and say, well, I don't agree with that because this, this and this. Yeah. You don't start, like, you know, threatening violence against them just because you disagree with them. And it felt like a completely alien situation for, you know, a supposedly anarchist book fair to have such a bunch of intolerant people shouting and screaming at me and other women.
Well, it sounds very much like Darvo. It's like they're attacking you and saying that they feel unsafe when it's you who's being victimised, ganged up on by a mob, basically, who are twisting it and making you know, threatening you and then saying, but you're threatening me. It feels like a patriarchal reversal that we've just seen time and time and time again.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. And I've seen it even more since, because on another couple of instances, a friend wanted to leaflet at the Manchester Anarchist Book Fair. She'd been involved in Manchester anarchist politics for quite a long time, had tried to get a meeting at the Manchester Anarchist Book Fair to have both sides discussing the issue, to try and sort of see if we can come to some sort of, you know, understanding of each other, maybe agree with each other on some things and think of a more productive way forward than just sort of, you know, what's going on at the moment where huge amounts of energy are being wasted. And at the last minute, she was told that the venue refused to allow the discussion to take place. So we had leaflets and we went there to hand out the leaflets. And we were basically, within about 5 minutes of starting handing out the leaflets, we were told that we had to leave because we were making trans people unsafe by being there and handing out leaflets. And as you say, it's a complete reversal of what's going on. We're just talking about women, how we value women-only spaces because of male violence, and how if you allow self-identification of gender, what mechanism is there to prevent any male from saying that he identifies as a woman, and being able to access women-only spaces and women-only positions and so on. And, you know, these are issues that clearly ought to be talked about. And yet, when we talk about them, we're told that we're the ones that are making them unsafe. And then physical force is used against us to prevent us discussing it. And two of us were actually carried out of that event just for handing out leaflets. And then the same thing at the Land Justice campaign. I'd actually been there for most of the weekend. There was a Land Justice camp. I had previously been involved in setting up a Land Justice Action Group, which was, the aim was to sort of hold protests to raise awareness of land justice issues, because the vast majority of land in this country and indeed around the world is controlled by rich and powerful people and organisations, and very many people, the majority of the population, are excluded from having access to land and having any kind of say in how that land is used, even though land is absolutely critical for our existence, for growing food, for housing, and so on. And I'd taken part in this, you know, setting this camp up, and people who I'd known for at least a couple of years had been friendly towards me. And then all of a sudden, on the day when we were walking across the moor as a protest walk, I was suddenly told that I wasn't welcome and I had to leave because I'd breached the safer spaces policy. And I said, well, what have I done? I haven't even said anything. And there were actually a couple of guys who intervened as well and said, well, she hasn't said anything. What are you accusing her of? And they said, oh, no, it wasn't what I'd said at the event. It was that I'd previously posted things on social media that made trans women feel unsafe. And I said, well, look, it's me who's now been thrown out of a couple of events and been threatened with violence. I've had death threats against me by trans activists. I'm not threatening anybody. I'm not a risk to anybody's safety. And there's no reason to throw me out. But they wouldn't listen, and they'd made their decision. And basically, it reminded me of being bullied at school, where a group of people just telling me you're not welcome here. And I actually got quite upset, and they said that I couldn't continue on the walk, and so I walked back to the camp. And none of them actually came to speak to me afterwards or explain why they'd done it or how I had any right of sort of appealing that decision or anything like that. And the same things happened when I wrote to them. They just ignored my letter effectively.
Well, I mean, it just sounds awful what happened to you. I'm so sorry. It's just, being kicked out effectively in the moor and having to walk through. And I've got something here I'll read out, because this is what they posted in No Apology, No Recognition. This came up on the LJN website. Land camp organisers are an autonomous working group that do not speak for the wider land justice network as a whole or any other working group. Land camp organisers acknowledge that our safer space policy was not clear enough in the process or content to be fit for purpose. We regret the confusion and agitation caused to all as a result of this. Land camp organisers look forward to feeding into a wider land justice network safer space process, which we hope will make clear that people involved in actively campaigning against trans rights will not be welcome in our future events.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely shocking that people can write safer spaces policies and completely ignore the fact that sexism exists and that women have got a right to talk about our bodies, our lives, and how gender identity theory impacts on our right to talk about those things. They are redefining the word woman to include males, and yet when we try and say, well, hang on, that affects us because we are women, it's like they call us Nazis and bigots and use that as an excuse to threaten violence against us. So where is the safety for women in being able to talk about the sexism that we have faced throughout our lives and what we see as the solutions to that sexism? It just feels like, as ever, males, the so-called safety and the feelings of males is given a much higher priority than the safety and the feelings of females. They've effectively created two classes of women. The ones that are trans women have the right not to be upset or offended, and the ones that are what they would call cis women can like it or lump it. Just replicates patriarchy all over again.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is quite important as well. If you're looking in the green movement, I think worldwide women do most of the agricultural labour, which is not something I was aware of until I looked into it. But they own less than 20% of the privately owned land. So I think that the fact that this is coming through in the environmental movement should have a bit more awareness of actually the inequalities that exist in the sexes and how this directly impacts on all the things that they should be fighting for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's critical that women are able to discuss issues around sexism and the imbalance in access to resources between, what women have got worldwide and what men have got worldwide, and indeed in this country as well. And you can't do that if you no longer have the language to describe women and men, for starters. If the word woman now incorporates males, how do you talk about sexism? You can't. This sort of changing of language affects us all. And I think it's kind of quite interesting. There's this pretense that you can identify into or out of oppression. It's just not true. In the UK, there's a system of primogeniture where the oldest son will inherit land and title from his father when the father dies, and women are specifically excluded from that process. Even if they are the eldest sibling, they will not inherit that land and title. Now, the Gender Recognition Act in 2004 said that if you get a gender recognition certificate, you are supposed to be the legally acquired gender for all purposes. But they added a specific exclusion in relation to primogeniture, which enabled men to retain control of the land and titles and power by saying that even if a woman changes to a man legally, she won't inherit. It still goes to the oldest son. That even though the oldest son might be younger than her.
Yeah. Well, it feels like, I hate to use the word, it feels like a land grab for women's rights. And it's like you say, the one area where there could have been a little bit of benefit for women, you can opt into a higher class. It doesn't go both ways, it feels.
To be honest, it's of peripheral interest to me because it is only a tiny percentage of women that would be affected by that. Yeah. But the point remains that when they passed the Gender Recognition Act, they were more than happy to give away women's rights to single-sex spaces and single-sex resources and so on, places and sport and so on. And yet, the one thing where they might be affected, they wouldn't allow it.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting, and it gets to the heart of what's going on. I think it's a really illuminating, like I say, it's only a small thing, because how many lords and ladies are likely to transition? I don't think there's been any that I'm aware of yet, but they've still thought enough to think about that and think about how it might impact men and make a little exclusion for them.
Yeah, I think there have been a couple, but they have, exactly. They're just worried about preserving their power and privilege effectively.
Well, I think if I was a woman and I was in a similar position, I'd think about transitioning if I could rob all my brother's lands off him.
Well, it's not really robbery. Oh, well, it's robbery. I mean, it's robbery for the fact that there's a tiny percentage of people in this country that own a huge percentage of the land. Yeah. And many of those are people who've owned that land, like the families have owned that land since 1066, effectively. Mm-hmm. It's been passed down through family, elder son to elder son, and the reason for doing that is because if you've got all that land and resources, you retain your power. Whereas if you divide it up equally, people have to pay inheritance tax, but most of these like estates of the landed gentry, they put them in trusts and so on, and just ensure that actually they never lose anything. They don't pay taxes on it. They don't pay inheritance taxes on it, and so they maintain the huge volumes of land that they've got, huge areas of land that they've got, which gives them power over other people. Mm-hmm. So the whole system is corrupt, and it's sexist, obviously, because women are excluded from. I mean, I can't remember what year it was, but women weren't even supposed to. Married women weren't allowed to own land, and if a single woman owned land, it became the property of her husband when she got married. So, there's been all sorts of exclusions to make sure that men kept the power, kept holding the power and the resources.
Well, this is just a continuation of that, I suppose, this little exemption.
I just wanted to talk about women-only spaces. Mm-hmm. They've been very important to me in terms of my political awareness. I got involved in politics around the time of Greenham Common, and through that I went to women-only meetings and women-only events, and they shaped the way that I saw the world. Initially, I felt uncomfortable. I felt guilty that we were excluding men from those spaces. But actually, when I went to those events, I realised just how different it was having a conversation without men present, because their priorities do tend to dominate meetings. Men are raised to be more confident speakers. Women are raised to kind of defer to what men think and not entirely trust our own judgment and kind of hedge everything that we say with, oh, sorry, and I'm not sure. And we tend to talk much more about our own experiences than about political theory. So there's big differences in how women and men speak in political contexts. And going to women-only events allowed subjects that weren't important to men, so wouldn't get discussed in mixed meetings, to be discussed by women, and then women to set our priorities around what we do about tackling those issues, such as, sexual harassment, sexual violence, how you deal with periods at work, or, things like that are just not really of interest to men in the main, don't come on their radar. And anyway, in 2014, there was an anarcho-feminist conference, which I went to. I felt a bit uneasy about it, to be honest, because they had a so-called safer spaces policy, and it talked about re-educating people, and it sounded a bit, I don't know. arrogant and off-putting, to put it bluntly. And I went to this session about what is gender, and it was run by two people who said they identified as trans. One was a woman who said she identified as they, and the other was a bloke sporting a beard who said he identified as she. And they said at the start of this workshop, well, we're not going to tell you what gender is. We actually want you to talk about it in your groups. Everyone broke into small groups. There was a little bit of discussion, and then people fed back. And in the main, what people said was, we didn't really know what gender was. And it became apparent that people were actually afraid to say what they thought. And I found that whole situation alarming. But then what happened was, somehow it got into just a discussion about people ranting about women asking for women-only spaces. And I was just like, this is supposed to be a feminist conference. Like, why on earth would people be complaining about women-only spaces? And I put up my hand, and I was one of the last people, well, I was basically the last person to speak. I started by saying that I was feeling very nervous, but I felt it was important to say the reason why women-only spaces are important is because women are socialised to be less confident and to not really speak up. And through women-only spaces, it enables women to find their voices. And then I said, and I've noticed that at this event, there are workshop sessions for people of colour and for trans people, but there are no sessions for women who were born as women. And when I said, and I wasn't really familiar with the language at that point. I was just trying to make a distinction between, between a so-called woman with a penis and a woman. And the whole meeting room just erupted. And all these, I would say, men who identified as women got up and walked out making loads and loads of noise, making loads of noise over the top of me and drowning me out. And when they'd left the room, the guy who was running the workshop turned to me and said, you need to think about how unsafe you've made all these people feel that they had to leave this room, leave this workshop, and effectively I needed to check my privilege. My heart had been already in my throat because I was so nervous speaking because of the atmosphere in there about, intolerance for people having a different opinion. And I couldn't actually think fast enough to respond, but I just thought, my God, this is just turning reality on its head. Here's a man who has no idea of what it's like to be raised as a woman and socialised to lack confidence and to be quiet. Here's a man telling me that I had made men feel unsafe by saying that women-only spaces are important. It really is turning reality on its head. Yeah. And that guy had a beard. Although he identified as she, he was never going to be mistaken for a woman. Yeah. He was never going to be treated as a second-class citizen or, denied a job because he might get pregnant or sexually harassed because someone thought he was a woman and women deserve it, or women are public property and, men can touch whenever they want to. I mean, effectively, what that demonstrated to me was that for all the claims that if a man identifies as a woman, he is a woman, you don't get rid of social conditioning that easy. The reality is those men that walked out and talked over the top of me were behaving exactly how men behave in mixed meetings when a woman says something that they don't want to hear. Rather than engaging with what she said and answering it respectfully and listening because it's something outside their own experience and perhaps they might, need to learn about that. Rather than doing that, they just talk over the top, make a noise, disrupt and, show contempt.
Well, that was really interesting because I didn't know about that, and I think it's all these little incidents that bring you to where you are, and I think that this perfectly illustrates the behaviour is typical male pattern behaviour, and it's again the patriarchal reversal of you're making me unsafe. Okay, wrapping up now, I just wondered if you've seen any seeds of change. Are things getting better? Are we able to speak more freely now in I'm thinking especially in social justice movements and anarchist spaces? Are you seeing any green shoots, anything we should be hopeful for?
I think we're still in quite an alarming situation where there are a considerable number of people who claim that they're in favour of social justice and the right to protest and freedom of speech, but that don't apply that to women who hold different views to them. And I find that quite shocking, but I do see signs of improvement in that. I think increasing numbers of people are realising just how totalitarian the trans activism is, in trying to, people still say far too often it's both sides, but I think people are waking up to the fact that there's only one side, which is trans activists, who are campaigning to stop women speaking, who are trying to get women to lose their jobs or be expelled from organisations, rather than engaging in discussion. I think people are waking up to what's going on, and the media have now finally started covering it as well, which is making a difference. So that's good. But God, how much of women's lives is being wasted on this when, it's just incredible. The arrogance that they have, that they don't need to discuss an issue that affects women. I just cannot fathom how people can think it is in any way acceptable to redefine the word woman, but prevent women from being part of that discussion. Yeah. It's just gobsmacking.
Okay, before we go, I'm just going to pump you for a little bit of gossip, because I hear Keir Starmer was a young lawyer who put himself forward to help represent you in the McLibel case. Now he's running for Labour leadership. What's the 411 on Keir Starmer? Would he get your vote?
Can't answer that. I'm not in the Labour Party. I'm an anarchist.
Diplomatic answer.
No, Keir was fantastic when we were fighting the McLibel case. He did not represent us because we weren't represented. We were representing ourselves in the longest court case in English legal history. And that was one of the reasons why the European Court found in our favour, was because we were representing ourselves, and it was such an unfair battle. But Keir did actually represent us at the European Court of Human Rights. And he was fantastic. He was a great person to work with, really helpful. He drafted our initial defence, as I recall, and if he hadn't done that, we probably would never have got our case off the ground, because I didn't have a clue how to draft a defence or do anything like that. But obviously the case went on for so long that there was a limit to how much anyone could help. The volume of documents, there were like 40,000 pages of documents, 100,000 pages of transcripts. So it was basically a full-time job, and he was a lawyer who already had a full-time job. So he was just giving us help in his free time, but he wasn't able to actually represent us until the case went to the European Court of Human Rights.
Okay. Well, there you have it. Helen Steel says Keir Starmer's a good lad.
He was back in the day. I haven't spoken to him for a few years, so I don't know.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast to discuss all this with us. There's a lot that I didn't know about, a lot obviously my listeners won't have known about, so thank you, Helen.
Thank you.